what do you think are the main blockages in the way of reaching this point where the presidents and prime ministers can come in? They're not going to be involved in deep negotiations. It should, as you say, be more or less sorted by then. There aren't many days left. So what's blocking us reaching that stage?
Well, I think the same things that have been blocking us really from the beginning, and that is, well, I guess there are probably three key issues. And I'd say those are, what is the correct level of responsibility for climate change and how should that be reflected?
So, sorry, when you say responsibility, you mean which countries are responsible?
Which countries are responsible and how do you assign responsibility? So ActionAid, we've been very clear that we really need to look at these things as a historical responsibility, as a climate debt which rich countries have built up over many years. So, for example, World Bank have recently released some figures saying that they think rich countries are responsible for around 70% of historic greenhouse gas emissions since 1850. You know, we had the Industrial Revolution first in the UK. It spread throughout Europe and America. Many of the developing countries have only really been having serious amounts of emissions in the last couple of decades, like China. So, how do you assign responsibility? All developing countries, and I think most of the NGOs here, think that it's very important that those countries that have got rich by burning fossil fuels take a proportionate amount of responsibility for doing that. So that means that, in line with what Kyoto has already agreed, that rich countries act first and act fastest in terms of reducing their emissions. So that means that they have to reduce their emissions by about 40% at least by 2020, and this is against a 1990 baseline. On the other hand, the United States in particular is very concerned about future emissions. And so they argue that China and India and other bigger developing countries will be responsible for a lot of emissions in the next couple of decades. So they want to make sure that that's recognised in a deal. And they say China is now the world's biggest polluter, and therefore they should have a similar level, or at least take some serious action on climate change. Now, very important thing needs to be said about that when you hear China is the world's biggest polluter. China has more than 1 billion people, so per person their emissions are still very low. In fact, no more than probably a fifth of the United States emissions. If you go to India, I think it's more like 1/20th of the United States emissions. So I think if you look at any fair solution to this, it is going to have to come down to something around what the per capita, the per person emissions are. If we can move to the next issue, which is around financing. So how are we going to reduce emissions and how are we going to enable countries to adapt to climate change? That's not going to be done for free. It's going to involve serious money. And it's going to involve transfers from the rich world to the poor world. So how much money do we need? Who controls it? And where do we get the money from? So developing countries have put all sorts of numbers out there. Some of them have assessed it against their GDP of rich countries. Some of them have called for a flat figure. We think that as a first start at ActionAid, the first start would be to say $200 billion in addition to your existing aid commitments. So in addition to the 0.7 target, for example, and we need to reach that number by 2020, but we can't wait until 2019 to start. We need to start next year. Rich countries are saying much less ambitious numbers, and the way they construct those numbers is deeply problematic in very many cases. So I think the European Union has got a number on the table, which they're one of the few rich country groups that have got a solid number. But when you begin to look into it, you see that it unravels. So they've called for 100 billion euros, but from that 100 billion euros, they think that at least 40 billion should be from developing countries themselves, and possibly another 40 from the private sector and from carbon trading, and only a small proportion at the top actually from public money. So that's a big problem. And I think that division between how much money is on the table and how much is needed is another blocking point in these talks. And then I think the final thing is who decides? Who decides how the money is spent? And this is what I alluded to at the beginning, that unless poor countries feel that they have a strong say in the governance of any institution that disperses money, then it's not going to be a fair deal.
Just to come in here, ActionAid has got, I don't know how many supporters, but it's got thousands of supporters in Britain, and it operates in other countries. Do you, you're talking at a policy level, you're talking about billions, you're talking about big issues. Do you think your supporters, that the message has got through to them, that it's something they understand or care about, or are you in danger of sort of running too far ahead and just operating at some slightly abstract level to many people?
No, not at all. I mean, I think there's absolutely widespread support for this across the world. And I think, in many rich countries, you've seen massive amounts of people who come out in favour of serious action on climate change. Just to give you one example, I mean, I'm obviously based in London, you can tell by my accent. We had the Wave in London, which was a massive climate change demo, the biggest ever climate change march in the UK. We had probably 60,000 people turning out in the streets of London on a cold December morning. So I think that there is a lot of passion for this issue. I think certainly amongst the young people, people slightly younger than me, climate change is a massive issue because it's primarily going to be people under the age of 25 who are going to be affected. I mean, we're talking about a deal that's going to last for, we hope, a solid deal that will last for decades to come. We're talking about numbers in 2020, so in 10 years' time. We're talking about what happens in 2050. I doubt, not wishing premature death on any of them, that many of the negotiators in these talks will be alive in 2050, and certainly not the leaders who will be coming next week. So I think it's, there's a very strong youth constituency, both represented here in Copenhagen and back home. And I don't think it's just the youth constituency. I think there's many different groups of people, from businesses to public sector, private sector, that really feel passionate about this issue and want their governments to take a lead.
And because we've had earlier today, we had a couple of people talking about forests, just to put that in, just to bring it in to your summary, where does that fit? This fits into the sort of who's going to cut what in terms of emissions and money. It's a sort of issue that cuts across the two, is it?
Yeah, I mean, we know that forests or deforestation probably contributes between 15 and 20% to the global total. So they are an important area we have to deal with, and it's not something we've dealt with effectively before under previous agreements. So one of the things we need to do is find a way to first reduce the rate of deforestation and then actually halt it altogether. And this is particularly important for those countries that still have rainforests, so not like countries in Europe where we've chopped down most of our forests many centuries ago. So particularly for countries like Brazil, Indonesia, the Congo, where there are still these tropical rainforests there. And what we need to do is find a way to make sure that those countries keep their trees standing, they don't cut them down. And that's going to involve some finances. We're going to have to pay for that. And if you think about it, why is it that there are rainforests in Brazil and Indonesia and other parts of the world and there aren't in Europe? It's because we cut our trees down. So we've done that. So we need to really, if we're talking about global benefits here, and we all benefit from things like the Brazilian rainforest, we're going to have to find a way to pay the people who live in those countries so that they can develop their economies without destroying their own environment and the world's environment.
And of the issues that you've rather neatly outlined for us, thank you very much, of sort of reduction in emissions and one more we should mention, I think, maybe transfer of technology, which always seems rather abstract and complicated, and people seem to mean different things by it. But is it a big issue?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's basically 4 issues that were agreed 2 years ago in Bali when these talks were started. The 4 were mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions; adaptation, enabling countries to adapt, particularly developing countries, and within those particularly very poor countries. And then the other 2 issues, finance and technology, are designed to deliver both the emissions reductions and enable adaptation. So technology is a crucial issue. And what it's about ensuring that developing countries have access to the very best technology so they can leapfrog the dirty industrial state of development that we experienced in the UK and in other rich countries. Because we can't afford for other countries to repeat the mistakes that we've made. There just isn't the carbon space, there's not the atmospheric space in the world for that to happen. So we have to find a way to make sure they don't do that. So that's about providing them with the very best renewable technology, so things like solar panels that are really state-of-the-art, wind farms, those kind of things. But also maybe some of the simpler things that perhaps are more widely available but have a cost attached to them. And we've seen the same thing in terms of, if you look at other issues not related to climate change, in terms of providing medicines to the developing world. We found that generic medicines have been a crucial way of ensuring that the poorest people get the healthcare they need. And it's similar with people's climate health, if you like, that they need to have access to the very best technologies, but at prices that they can afford.